Melbourne stands in the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and it's upon these ancestral lands that the NGV is built, and it's to their elders, past, present and emerging, that I pay respect. I'd also like to acknowledge our special guest, Dr. Iana Gregory, the curator of the exhibition and a well-known, I should say, famous art historian. She Opens Sunlight is the first exhibition on Australian Impressionism at the NGV in nearly a decade and features more than 250 works of art. It's one of the most ambitious attempts, or exhibitions I should say, on the subject that we've seen in many years, with an incredibly rich and complex structure through which audiences can explore the hallmarks of Impressionism in this country and the artists at the very centre of the movement. I'd like to personally thank our colleagues from around Victoria and interstate who have lent important and integral works to this exhibition. Without your support and generosity, this would not have been possible. When we began the conversations about staging a new Australian Impressionism exhibition, it was important for us to retell this aspect of Australian art history in a way that added a fuller and more honest context for the movement. Drawing on many years of research and a breadth of material, She Opens Sunlight offers a fresh take on the historic movement with a particular focus on the relationships between the Australian Impressionists themselves. Audiences will discover these artists in a way that is both candid and thought-provoking. We see their personal triumphs and rivalries, which in turn allow us to appreciate the works painted in this context with a newfound depth of perspective. As you will see, there's also an exploration of the work or perspectives of women from the movement and the contextualising of Australian Impressionism within the context of a longer history in this country. The exhibition includes works by the stalwarts of Australian Impressionism, including Tom Roberts, Frederick Hubbard, Jane Sutherland, Arthur Streeton, Charles Conda, Clara Southern, John Russell, E. Phillips Fox and Ethel Carrick. But importantly, the exhibition also brings to light the work of artists whose impact is only now coming to be appreciated. These include Issa Rae, Maeve Vale, Jane Price and Iana Gregory. As a result of the extensive research conducted in order to realise this ambitious project, the NGV has also made a number of key acquisitions and discoveries. This includes the recently acquired She Opens Sunlight by Tom Roberts, from which the exhibition takes its name, as well as Issa Rae's luminous portrait of a young girl acquired by the gallery in 2020. Following a loose chronology, the exhibition charts the key milestones and achievements of the Australian Impressionists and the places dear to them. A highlight for audiences is sure to be a presentation of more than 50 works from the landmark 9x5 Impression exhibition, which, as I'm sure many of you know, you all visited high school, takes its name from the dimensions of the cigar box lids upon which many of the works were painted. So the installation of these 9x5-inch works is based on an illustration that we have from the 1880s exhibition. So it's a recreation of one of the most sympathetic to that period. And uniquely, the exhibition also draws attention to the relationships and influences between Australian Impressionists and their international counterparts. Works by Australian artists are juxtaposed with those by Claude Monet, Alfred Sisley, James Abbott, McNeill Whistler and other works from the collection. The exhibition is an exciting compendium to the NGV's canon of exhibitions on Australian Impressionism, as well as a complement to this year's Melbourne Winter Masterpieces exhibition, French Impressionism, from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which will open in June. The She Opens Sunlight is accompanied by an absolutely stunning publication exploring the historical contexts, personal relationships and the importance of place in the trajectory of Impressionism in this country. The publication features 200 high-quality reproductions, as well as essays from many prominent art historians, writers and curators. This exhibition has also been curated by, I have to say, the preeminent scholar of Australian Impressionism, being Dr. Iana Gregory, who's been a delight to work with and incredibly devoted. So thank you from all of us for your wonderful support. And I'd like to acknowledge our great colleagues, Dr. Angela Hesson, our Curator of Australian Art, and Sophie Gerhard, Assistant Curator of Australian Art, who've also worked incredibly hard, in fact tirelessly from what I've been able to see, and in a very difficult COVID year as well. Thank you very much. The exhibition would not have also been possible without, I have to say, truly phenomenal support from our colleagues around the country. In particular, significant volume and quality of loans from the National Gallery of Australia, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Art Gallery of South Australia and the Art Gallery of Western Australia. In addition, we've had wonderful support In fact, you won't find good Impressionists anywhere around the country right now, thanks to us. But with great support from the State Library of Victoria, the National Portrait Gallery, Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, New England Regional Art Museum, State Library of New South Wales, National Museum of Australia, Art Centre Melbourne, Ballarat Art Gallery, Benalla Art Gallery, Geelong Art Gallery, the Melbourne Club, Melbourne Museum, University of New England, University of Queensland, Wesfarmers, Wesley College and Westpac Corporate Art Collection. If you know any other gallery that's got one, quickly tell me. The NGV is also grateful to the private lenders. There are many wonderful works still in private hands which are also included in the exhibition. And of course, again, thank you to the Victorian Government for their ongoing support. We're now going to go on a highlight tour. We're going to look at key works and our curatorial staff are going to talk to those as we walk through. So I now invite you to join me. Okay, so you just walked through an introductory corridor, which is really talking about the precursors. So we're seeing Bulow and Herrera, for example. So these are the artists that have been great influence to our next generation of Impressionist artists, who are joining them in the wall behind. You see the wall behind is a very impressive array of artists who are well known to us, but also what this tells us is about the relationships between the artists. The fact that we have, Roberts painted by Street, McCubbin and self-portrait. Many great discoveries I want here, and also many well-known and well-celebrated and well-published portraits as well. It's a very ambitious way of just sort of amplifying the depth of talent that was very much attributed to this school. But we really want to take you now to sort of the main heart of the exhibition, and this is where Anne's going to take over and start to take us on a journey of the different themes as they roll out.
Thank you. We've just come through a corridor which explains how marvellous Melbourne was at the time when these artists were working, and also that Tom Roberts went overseas and learned a lot while he was overseas, probably saw works by Manet. But it begins with the great friendship between Roberts and McCubbin. And you see here one of Robert and McCubbin's famous paintings, Lost, and beside it, one of Robert's best-known paintings, Summer Mornings. Summer Mornings. Tip, yes. And up here, if you look closely, you'll see a robin in the tree, and that suggests that Tip is not going to keep on, that they're going to make friends again. But what's important about this group of plein air works is that the artists are doing something totally different from what the earlier artists had done. No longer do you see long panoramic landscapes. They go right into the bush, and you feel the feel of the bush, the feel of the twigs under your feet. You can hardly see the sky, and this is a totally new thing. And what might surprise you, if you look around, turn around, work by Roberts and McCubbin again, this time at Mentone, again showing the great friendship between these two artists, but showing seaside subjects. And you think, oh yes, seaside subjects. I've seen seaside subjects plenty of times. Totally new subject at this time. And all the seaside subjects you've seen come after this, the Australian ones. And these were subjects which the French Impressionists also did, and they were new and novel at the time. The next plein air room is this large room in here, with some of the favourite paintings by these artists. In this room, on that wall, we have Conda learning from artists in New South Wales, in Sydney, painting alongside Roberts, or painting with Julian Ashton and Henry Forward at Richmond. But Decorative school. We don't now because it's wrong. But they were neither a school nor were they at Heidelberg, they were at Eaglemont. But here we see, instead of Roberts and McCubbin, or Roberts and Conda as in Sydney, we see Streeton and Conda. This is a wall of Streeton's wonderful works. Hidden underneath this work, I'm told by the conservators, is Conda's signature. He was painting a similar subject in the same area at the same time, I suspect. But he had a quirky sense of humour. And if you compare the two works over there, one by Streeton and one by Conda, both painted at Eaglemont, probably side by side, with Whelan sitting on the log, or standing nearby, you see the difference between these two artists, competing with each other, but expressing their own personality in the paintings. And that's one of the things we've been very keen to do. And here we have Jane Sutherland. Jane Sutherland wasn't able to go to Box Hill or Eaglemont and camp there because she was a lady. And at this time it would be not proper for a lady to camp overnight with boys. So she caught the train there and caught the train back. The same with Jane Price, who's over there. But she was at Eaglemont, and I find it fascinating that the little girl in her painting and the painting in the Box Hill room, the little girl has always got her back to you. Whereas in Ellwood and Conda and Ashton's works across the road, just there, the girls are all facing you. I don't know the answer to that, but it's something to think about.
So if you follow us around the corner now and into this little room, those of you that can fit, it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to the title work of our exhibition. On the far end of the wall there you can see She Opened Sunlight by Tom Roberts. And you can see this work really exemplifies many of those ideas that Anna mentioned previously that were so radical about Impressionism in Australia. You can see in particular these wonderful heightened contrasts of the blue and gold Australian landscape, such a kind of iconic scene. And also, when you have a moment to get in and look at that work more closely, look at the brushwork itself. So this is a work which has been executed with great speed. You can see the kind of energy behind brush strokes. And this is all about that impressionist idea of capturing fleeting effects, capturing a moment which is going to pass at any second. So this is a really kind of exciting and energetic moment in art history. Now, this work is a very important recent acquisition for NGV. We purchased it at the end of 2019. There are very few works from the exhibition in which this was first exhibited still available, so this was a tremendously exciting moment for us. And that exhibition was the 1889 9x5 exhibition. And Anna is going to talk to us a little bit more about that now.
It's probably the exhibition which has had most publicity about it, but perhaps you've never seen the works displayed like this before. It's the exhibition where the artists for the first time described themselves as Impressionists. They did that in the catalogue and in the writing and a letter that they wrote to the Argus. And they called themselves Impressionists because they were creating impressions on these small 9x5 inches works. But they were also making a statement that a painting is done en plein air, rapidly, but it's a finished work. And a lot of the critics were very critical of them and said, no, they're not. These are like Impressionist works. So the critics also recognised the similarity between what they were doing capturing the time of day, the mood, the moment that the Impressionists have been trying to do in France, and also that they were revolutionaries, like the Impressionists had been in their first exhibition in France. And they also were influenced by Whistler. Roberts had seen a show by Whistler in London, and a lot of Whistler's works had poetic, moody titles. And these works, if you look at the titles on the wall, you'll see that a lot of them had poetic, moody titles. Simply titles like Yellow and Grey, or listen to the music, Handel's Varcoe. And so this is what they're trying to create in this famous exhibition. And as I said before, it's what gave them the name Australian Impressionists.
I'm standing now in front of a couple of names transparent light. People's come a little bit further, people's still coming. And an amazing square landscape, one of Strickland's great pictures. And it's all those things that Anna's just been talking about the immediacy and response to nature, and immediate effect to the landscape. So this is Hawkesbury River, New South Wales, North Richmond's here. This is called the Richmond, or it was called the Richmond Lowlands. And last week I have to point out this entire left-hand side was covered in water because of the floods. So, which isn't the first time. The people that lived there at the time, they've also been through that. But it's a remarkable work, and it's actually gone through conservation. Actually, I might just point out that Streeton each day, apparently, hopped on a horse called a pawnbroker, which he bought for £1, and travelled from Richmond all the way around to paint in front of the landscape to be truly inspired by this light and this lush atmosphere. He says he was intoxicated by light, and the event was very rapid and fast, so quite remarkable. But it was exhibited in Melbourne in 1896 and purchased by the NGV, which would have been obviously ecstatic about. And he used the money to go overseas, so this was contemporary artwork that came in. And since that time, it had discoloured surfaces built up slowly over time. And last year during lockdown, I had a chance to clean the artwork. And so we are seeing it for the first time in 115 years maybe, as he intended. So it's really quite a remarkable change. So if you know the work, you'll be surprised by its saturation, its colour. I encourage you to really see this work. It's beautiful.
Can I just add that in this corridor here, instead of Robertson's, Conda, Robertson McCubbin, Streeton and Conda, we have Roberts and Streeton. The dynamics between the artists is constantly changing, and they were both in Sydney together because they escaped from the economic depression in Melbourne, which Angela is going to talk about in the next room.
You will notice a transition in this group from those wonderful sun-drenched landscapes of Hawkesbury that Michael was just speaking about, to the infinitely moodier and more atmospheric realm of Chartersville, in which you find yourself now. And you will see here that this is an area in which the tone is a much more subtle one. We're looking at the twilight palette, the two works beside me, very titled Moonrise, very emblematic of the general mood of artists working in this area. So, Chartersville was an old homestead. It was situated in East Ivanhoe, on rising land above the Yarra, and it was rented initially by artist Walter Withers, and subsequently by Phillips Fox and Tudor George Tucker, who were then running the Melbourne School of Art. Now, Melbourne School of Art had a summer school at Chartersville, and many of the artists who you see in this room attended that school. Now, if you look to the wall that I'm facing, you'll see a wonderful group portrait. This is by Phillips Fox. And this is of several of the artists who were working at Chartersville at the time. You can see they're all women in that group, and one of those women is Iana Gregory. Now, Iana Gregory is another artist who we are very excited to have acquired recently. Gregory had a real interest in the idea of knowing a landscape intimately. She specialized and you'll see on the wall that has the massed kind of much smaller pictures, a beautiful little work that we acquired recently, her garden scene at Charlottesville. Next to it is a work by Gregory's very good friend Jane Price, with whom she lived late in life. And both artists were interested in the idea of a kind of spiritual relationship between nature and art and landscape. They were in fact founding members of the Theosophical Society, and I think they bring a really wonderful contemplative tone to landscape painting in this period. And you see this echoed also in the works by John Sutherland and Clara Sophie on the face of the wall. Now, a brief note on the palette of works in this room. Anne mentioned in relation to the 9x5s the influence of Anglo-American artist James Abbott Whitney Whistler. Now, Whistler was very prominent in London at the time. The exhibition to which Anne alluded was called Notes, Harmonies and Nocturnes, which was in London in 1884. And I think that idea of the nocturne is one that we see realised quite fully and beautifully and provocatively here. There is something very Whistlerian in the palette of these works too. Now, as we move into the next phase, we're going to have the opportunity to think about the influence of Europe on Australian artists and the works that they produced when they travelled there themselves. We're not going to stop in the Whistler works because it's a very small space, but when you have a chance to look at them, we are extremely lucky to have such a wonderful selection of works by Whistler in Australia. But we're going to move on into the room which is looking at the French influence on Australian Impressionism.
We are so lucky that the NGV purchased this work by Alfred Sisley, which shows the cliff face here. And then John Russell, who travelled through France and Spain with Roberts many years earlier, went to France and painted Madame Sisley seated there with the same cliff behind her. It's miraculous that these two paintings could be put together. When he was in France, he attended Cornwall School and he met a fellow student who's very much better known than John Russell, Vincent van Gogh. And he befriended Van Gogh, who didn't at that time have a lot of friends. And Van Gogh was very interested in Blossom and Japanese art, and he painted works of Blossom, and so did Russell, inspired by Van Gogh and Japanese art. And then one day, while he was out painting, he came across this other artist called Claude Monet, and he recognised him. And Russell had private means, and he was able to hire a porter for Claude Monet and help him in that way. He had a lovely wife who cooked beautiful meals, and he invited Monet home. And so by befriending Monet in this way, Russell got a very privileged introduction to what Monet was doing in his paintings. And here in this exhibition, we have two works which were shown in London in the same exhibition as Monet's work and compared with them at the time by somewhat critical critics. And then we have a work in the NGV's collection, and then by Monet, and then some works by Russell, painted under the influence of Monet. And the other artist who came across Monet while he was in France was Charles Conda. He's disappeared from the exhibition until now because he travelled abroad much earlier than Robertson Street, and McCubbin, unfortunately, wasn't able to travel because he had 7 children and he was a teacher at the NGV school. But Conda saw Monet's exhibition, an exhibition of haystacks, and you can see on that wall a group of haystacks. painted by Conda. Now, I think Angela is going to briefly introduce another Melbourne acquisition.
I am, thank you, Anna. So this is another recent acquisition to the NGV's collection, which we acquired last year. This is Isa Ray's younger letter from around 1892, about which we are just so excited. Isa Ray was born in Melbourne, and she studied initially at the National Gallery School before travelling to Paris in the late 1890s, as was the custom for many Australian artists furthering their artistic education. She moved on from Paris to a small coastal village called Étaples, which was on the English Channel. It was a fishing village, and it was a hub for an expatriate Australian artistic community, as well as for a number of French artists. This wonderfully, I think, evocative and engaging work sees Ray working in a characteristically French Impressionist manner. So you can see that really high-keyed palette which conveys so effectively these effects of dappled sunlight. There is also something really unusual in the scale of this work, producing what is quite a kind of a sentimental subject on this grand scale, lends it a really monumental, almost heroic quality, which is quite unconventional for portraits of children. Ray produced a number of other portraits of children around this time, and interestingly, while she doesn't have the profile currently of many of the other artists that we are looking at in this exhibition, she was actually very highly regarded at the time. She was one of the first, if not the first, Australian artists to have her work acquired by a French art institution, which was an enormous honour in this period. So we feel tremendously fortunate to be able to add this work to our collection. And I'm now just going to hand over to Sophie, who's going to broaden this context a little bit more with one of Ray's contemporaries, Ethel Carrick.
Yes, thank you, Angela. So if I could just draw your attention to these four works behind me by British-born artist Ethel Carrick. So after studying at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, which was quite a conservative school at the time, Carrick moved to France in 1905, and this was where she developed this wonderful, luminous, colourful palette that we celebrate Carrick for today, and also these themes of outdoor leisure that we see so much in Carrick's work. We see beachgoers and people promenading around market squares. So Carrick spent a lot of time in Australia. She actually married E. Phillips Fox, the Australian artist, and the two travelled back and forth from Europe to Australia a number of times. But at the outbreak of the Second World War, Carrick found herself to be visiting Fox's family in Melbourne, and Fox actually died quite soon after they arrived. So from then on, Carrick adopted Melbourne as her home, used it as a base to embark on her many painting expeditions. She actually lived on a longboat in Tunisia for a while and travelled Africa and Europe all on her own. It was quite remarkable for a woman at the time. So we've really adopted her into this story of Australian Impressionism for this wonderful contribution that she made to the movement here. So I'm going to walk you through to this next room. Before I hand it back to Anna, I want to introduce you to the themes that we have in this gallery. So the overarching title is Australian Narratives, and we're presented with works by the Impressionists, which were all being created around this burgeoning conversation surrounding national identity in Australia. It was being spoken about in literature and political commentary, and the arts artists were actively involved in this conversation as well. We've also got a sort of side theme in this room, a longer history, where we see 5 works by Wurundjeri artist William Barrack, who was also practicing at the same time as the Impressionists at the turn of the century and in Victoria. And the positioning of Barrack in this room next to these wonderful examples of non-Indigenous Australian iconography. We've got the sheep shearer, the pioneer, the bushman. The positioning of these works alongside these sort of blockbuster Impressionist works reminds us of Australia's Australia's art history that went back over 65,000 years by this point, reminding us that the Impressionists were not working in a vacuum, and that they were in no way Australia's first school of national art, although this is sort of a conversation that does get brought up when the Impressionists are raised in media and whatnot. It also works to problematise this narrative of what we see in Impressionist works, defining what it really looks like to be Australian. The work of William Barrick and the art of First Nations people was a thriving and dynamic art practice, and it serves to remind us that the conversation surrounding national identity in Australia is complex and intense and often tragic. So, although Australian Impressionists were an important aspect of Australian art history, we really are reminded here that they were just one moment within a far longer history in Australia.
Yes, and I think it's very important that we call this room the Australian narratives, because in one sense, the works in this room, although they are the best known paintings probably, apart from the 9x5s, by the artists we call the Australian Impressionists, they're not Impressionist works. And they're not all the same. Roberts, McCubbin and Streeton were all doing something different. Roberts was very interested in movement, and you can see in this well-known painting belonging to the National Gallery Victoria how he's managed to get the backs so they are as if they're moving. And he had been to a lecture in Melbourne given about the photographer Ellwood, who was very interested and probably the first artist to talk about what movement was and explain that legs of a horse didn't all lift up all at once, but they were different. And so you see in this painting, Roberts capturing the way a horse moves. And we've included also, for the first time amongst his works, a film footage by a photographer who worked with Roberts when he was a photographer's assistant in Melbourne, early on before he learned how to paint. The photographer and Edward Sestier, who was sent out to Australia by the Lumiere brothers. And you know the Lumiere brothers were the first people to make films. And so we had a very early film made in Australia by about Melbourne Cup, but he was interested in movement. And of course, the artists who were interested in movement were some of the French Impressionists, such as Gerhard, such as Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. It's not something that is only Muybridge and Roberts. It is a worldwide movement of people interested in how things move. Michael, I think, is going to talk about the painting, The Pioneer.
Which really needs no introduction. I think Gerhard McCubbin is the pioneer from 1904, one of the great icons of Australian art, obviously. Perhaps I'll just briefly sort of say that, as Anna was mentioning, these pictures have a whole lot of narrative elements to them, so they're not, in a sense, the true Impressionist landscape. But McCubbin was very faithful to the idea of immediacy in response to nature, that Impressionist idea of truth to nature. And so we know from historical records he actually painted these panels outside. And so he actually dug a ditch and lowered them down so he could actually reach the top of the canvas as he needed to. And through technical analysis, we even know there's dirt stuck in the little panel where it got stuck to the front of the wet paint. It's kind of a remarkable thing. The other sort of strange thing, this is a bit of a COVID moment, is that during lockdown, I used to walk around in these galleries. This was upstairs at the time, in the dark. I had a torch and I'd check all the artworks as part of the ongoing care and custodianship of the collection. And I noticed one day, as I was coming past, you might have heard this story, that there's a textual form that you can't see from that guy, but in raking light in the dark, I could see that there's something underneath the paintbrush. And so I went back to my office and I looked at X-rays I'd done 13 years before. It's a bit embarrassing, 13 years to work this out. But anyway, He'll be trying to work that for a long time. And I realised that underneath this central panel is a painting called Found, which has been lost for many, many years. It was found, was painted in 1893. It was a very large, we now know how large it was. It was a very, very large, major composition by McCullum. He exhibited at the Victorian Art Society. It was highly well reviewed. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances of the time, it didn't sell. And that's the last we've heard of it. We always knew what it looked like because he kept a little photo of it in a sketchbook, in a scrapbook, sorry, which we actually had in the NGV. And so I looked at the form of the X-ray. I've seen it somewhere before, and I realised it was in the scrapbook, and there was this photo of Found. So Found is below this work, which is kind of amazing. It's been hidden. It's on. Actually, it's been on display the entire time, but obviously below the surface of the paper. But what is interesting about it is that looking very carefully at the photo, I can see that parts of Found composition are still here. And so he didn't often what McCullum would turn the paint upside down and start again, or he might paint it out completely. He actually merged one to the other. It was an ongoing project, and obviously as it evolves over time, he changes the idea, because initially Found was a depiction of a bushman finding a lost child who was very big, possibly dead, which is a very tragic sort of scene, obviously. A scene he'd obviously explored before with Lost, also in art collection. But because over time he obviously thought about different ways to work it. Many years later, in 1904, it evolves into this composition. So it's an amazing indication of his testament to a project, like a massive project that eventuates into the pioneer. It's one of the great icons and probably the most well-known work.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for 30 years of dedication to research as well. I will see what you'll find in 20 years. So let's come through the conclusion of the exhibition. This is an amazing room, of course. I mean, it's just interesting, if you just look at these works here, we've got the McCullum's Bush Burial, which is one of the key work really at the Geelong Art Gallery. And then similarly, here McCullum's Down in His Life, which is, you know, one of the hardest pictures to extract out of Perth, I have to say. So, you know, we've had incredible support from our sector. But at the very end of the exhibition, it concludes with this masterpiece by Street called Fires On, which is very generously lent to us by the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Next to and flanked by these remarkable works by William Barry. So that concludes the exhibition. You can see it's incredibly ambitious. It's been a labour of love for many of us for many, many years. We hope that you'll enjoy it. So thank you for your attendance this morning.